This is Watercolor Lesson 10, Understanding Value. Please keep in mind that you do not have to watch this video. You can just look at the PowerPoint presentation, as everything that I would be telling you or showing you in class will be on the PowerPoint presentation. This is just if you work better when you hear the information out loud. Okay, Watercolor Lesson 10, Understanding Value. Of all the variables we employ as painters, value is the hardest worker. We can be very loose and casual with our drawing. We can allow the edges of separate shapes to blur and merge. We can be personally expressive or even downright psychedelic with color. As long as the relative values are reasonably true, we can still produce a believable sense of light, space, and substance. This is why, at the beginning of the process, it's important to ask, what role does value play in this picture? The highlights have been reserved, the darks are dark enough, and the value range is appropriately wide. Attention has been paid to accuracy of value, leaving the way clear to be relaxed about drawing. The result is lighthearted, yet perfectly solid. Understanding the role value plays in the scene is always a good place for an artist to start. I'd go further and say that it's an essential first step for most watercolor paintings. In some pictures, value plays a less obvious part in the describing of the narrative content. This does not necessarily mean that the relative darks and lights do not need to be represented carefully. On the contrary, paying attention to values may be more important in a subtle scene than one with a bold pattern of dark and light. The transparency of watercolor creates the need for us to make decisions about value at the very beginning of the painting process. Once we commit to a value for a given shape, it's awkward, if not impossible, to make it lighter. To help sort out the relative darkness of each major shape in the scene, there are a number of questions to keep in mind. The answers to the questions are often quite obvious. The tricky part is remembering to ask them. As long as the values are correct, color can be exaggerated. I wanted to transmit the feeling of powerful energy in Canyonlands National Park by pushing the color to an extreme. Holding on to fairly accurate values allowed me to do so without losing the illusion of light and space. In this painting, the artist established the widest possible range of values by making the sky and dark parts of the building as dark as possible and leaving the doorway pure white. The spotlit section of the wall had to fall somewhere in between. It could have been a little darker or a little lighter, and the painting would still have great power. In this painting, on the other hand, the choices that will support the illusion of white ice and snow exist in a much narrower range. There's very little pure white paper left on the page, but the artist's subtle hand and eye create the feeling that everything on the ground is white. Identifying the lightest part of the picture. Imagine a room that's lit by overhead fluorescent tubes and a bank of windows along the north side. The walls and ceiling of the room are painted white. If you were making a painting of the room, it would be easy to assume that the walls should be left the white of the paper. The white walls and the white paper, no problem. But the windows, which often have a cool bluish cast, are much brighter than the walls, and the warm yellow fluorescent lights are even lighter than the windows. If you left the walls white, how would you get the windows and lamps to appear lighter? This conundrum is why it's especially important to ask yourself right from the beginning, what is the lightest part of the picture? The problem in this case lies in the assumption that the walls are white. For watercolor purposes, they are not white. If you were actually painting the walls and not a picture of them, it's true that you'd be dipping into a big can of white paint. This is the source of confusion. Your brain is telling you the walls are white, but your eye knows that they are not the lightest shapes in the picture. In a watercolor, you cannot get any lighter than the white of the paper. It makes sense to reserve it for the lightest part of the scene and darken everything else relative to that. If, as is the case in this hypothetical painting, the lightest parts were yellow And blue, you would probably want to apply a faint glaze of color over the white, which would darken it a little. This shifts the value scale for the entire painting. The walls must be made dark enough to make the fluorescent lights seem bright by comparison, but not so dark that they don't seem white, and so on all the way up the scale to the darkest darks. How dark we make a shape in a watercolor is always a relative matter. What we know is firmly rooted in the language of meaning. Saying the words old gray barn calls forth a host of associations, somewhat different for each of us, but always evocative and persuasive. Our ideas about a subject can profoundly affect what we think we see. In the early stages of making a painting, I like to direct my questions to the abstract qualities of the image to keep from being misled by meaning. There's plenty of time to check in later to make sure the story is being told, but for now, I want the simple visual reality. When we're assessing value, it helps to use the language of pure form. It can be very difficult at first to ignore your insistent brain, but after a while, it begins to feel like a vacation. Take a close look at the outbuildings in the photograph. Which is darker, the sunlit part of the gray barn or the shadowed part of the white building? What we call something can create conflict between the brain and the eye. Seeing the two surfaces as shapes rather than buildings eliminates any confusion about their relative values. It helps to squint. Even though the light on the rocks in the foreground has not been left white, it appears brighter than the white boathouse. Proximity to much darker shapes makes the sunlit, upward-facing rock surfaces seem relatively brilliant. What do you think? Is the boathouse pure white paper? Let's take a moment to talk about the white paper. With a transparent medium, light passes through the paint and bounces off the paper back to the viewer's eyes. As the source of light in a watercolor, therefore, the paper is very important, but it is not sacred. I definitely prefer paintings that allow the paper to remain visible through the paint, but this does not necessarily mean that pure white paper must be reserved. If there's nothing white in the picture, then there does not need to be any white paper. Students have told me that they were taught, if it doesn't show some white paper, it's not a watercolor. Excuse me, but this is nonsense. I think it's actually a bigger problem to leave too much white than not enough. Even in a scene with large light areas, saving the white paper for where it's really needed can increase the illusion of convincing light. It's unfortunately quite common to leave a little gap of white paper between shapes, partly as a dam to keep washes from merging and partly just to produce some kind of sparkle. The result is usually a flattening of the space. Since all the shapes are surrounded by little hard edge halos, they all have equal prominence. The painting looks like a collage of cut and pasted components, or a mosaic, with white grout lines between the tiles. With so many gratuitous whites, the few that are trying to represent important lights cannot stand out. Even though our brains know where the elements of the scene are relative to each other, our eyes are getting a different message here. The mosaic quality of the painting creates a sense that each shape is in the same plane as its neighbors. Please tell me you don't like this painting. Allowing adjacent shapes to touch contributes to the feeling of space. It seems possible to walk around the trees without bumping into the white lines. In this painting, the relatively small whites are no bigger than the halos in the mosaic orchard scene from before, but they are there to fill a pictorial need. The slivers of white on the right-facing surfaces of the fence do much of the work of describing the sunlight. All of this discussion hopefully underscores why it's so important that you ask, are there whites to reserve? Generally, I prefer creating lights by simply leaving them. I can pre-wet the area if I want a soft edge, or leave it dry for a hard edge, but in either case, I put the paint where I want it and leave it alone. For me, the default approach to reserving lights comes down to this. If you don't want paint somewhere, don't put it there. And one small rant. Do not paint with a brush in one hand and a paper towel in the other. How confident will your stroke be if you're already thinking about removing it? If you're unsure of the mark you're about to make, you have more awareness work to do. Where's your practice paper? Remember, the goal is to actually become a better painter, not to appear to be one. Reserving non-white elements. For every new layer you apply, some of the previous layer probably needs to be reserved. Locating these relative lights by drawing them with pencil or pale paint makes it easier to apply the new layer with confidence. It's truly amazing how easy it is to paint right over a highlight 10 seconds after you say out loud, "I don't want to cover that highlight." Knowing what needs to be reserved from the previous layer and remembering to do it are skills that come partly from practice and partly from taking responsibility. The benefits of practice take time to be seen, of course, but being in charge produces results immediately. The language of watercolor requires a way of thinking that eventually becomes second nature. Meanwhile, timing is everything. Remember to ask, what needs to be reserved? And make sure to ask it before the next layer is applied, as this establishes good habits and eliminates the need for the paper towel and the scrubby. So for your assignment today, I want you to paint a picture. And in the painting, make it a point to reserve the whites before painting. Take it a step further and reserve non-white spaces as well. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be looking for in today's assignment. I want to see the areas where you reserved the very lightest parts of the painting, and then you used that and went from there to create the darker ones. Okay, sounds good? All right, have fun.